Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Puzzling Minds Podcast. It's your host, Michael Maddocks here, certified health and wellness coach and self-published author. For today's episode, in a long-awaited process, I will be discussing my research that I've been doing and finally drafted up the complete version, therefore writing a book about it. I started this research about 2 years ago. Prior to that, I was focusing on my well-being back in 2020, and when I had moved from Flagstaff to Phoenix, I decided, hey, why not just, reread some books and, go through our notes. I collected a plethora amount of self-care books, nutrition books, psychology books, all the while I was healing from my own trauma. Trauma has been in my family for the past 3 generations, mine, my mom's, and her mom. I fell in love with the idea and the Scientology behind trauma, how trauma affects the body physiologically. I read this book called The Body Keeps the Score, and I just started seeing all these connections tying into other self-care books. However, a lot of authors only focus in on one idea or one perspective or one goal. For instance, I love connection boards. I think seeing it in my mind process on how this connects to this. Oh, wait, but this also shares this. And then this guy correlates to all these functions for ourselves. So, for today's episode, I will be going through that process. And at any point you get bored, just pause and get back to it. I will try and make this episode as enthusiastic as possible. I had previously done this recording and I just felt about it. Therefore, here we are. Take 2, actually, when we're trying to discuss this. However, I've done videos in the past. Work into that. So, where I started with this research of mine, like I said, I have grasped the knowledge from receiving it during my own studies. I self-educate. I'm a self-educator. I believe in self-educators. I think they are very resourceful, and if they retain the information, which is really hard sometimes, especially when you're delving into many topics, it's really hard to retain, and because you're not like studying it, so it's going to be in our short-term memory. Like I said, I got a lot of self-care books and nutrition books and psychology books. So one night I decided to take all of them and start creating notes. Those notes turned into flashcards, and those flashcards became pins on my wall. And the best way to describe it is a crime scene murder board. If you've ever seen those in television or movies or even in person, all those little threads and tacks and all these connections, that's what it looked like. And I still have it up right now until I move. So I wanted to get this video done. So then, after I had all that put up, I started writing my book. Afterwards, I decided, you know what? I really want it on this trifold. I found out that I'm not an artistic person, and I wanted to draw it out. I wanted to write it. I wanted to, do it by hands, but that's just not me. So, as a result, I put it on a Canva, and I did it myself. And it took about 4 days to do this because I work full time. I'm in school, and I have all my other projects in my company. So when we, how do I even want to? Let's go back to the beginning. So while I was doing this, I was also trying to figure out, okay, what was my healing journey like with trauma? And what are some correlations that other people have brought into their own healing journey? So going back, we have experienced multitudes of different forms of trauma generationally. A century ago, starting off, and about at that time in the 20s, 30s, psychology and mental health was abstract. It wasn't of the norm. It was deemed as maniac, psychotic, lunatic. Um, you were put basically in an asylum or a loony bin. Well, come to find out, I believe in my own expertise that it was all because we weren't taught on how to heal and work through our trauma. Therefore, a lot of us tend to stress a lot. We experience a lot of war. We experience a lot of scarcity. We experience a lot of neglect growing up as kids. Maybe we only had one of two parents. Maybe the other parent was off fighting or dead or um, left for another family because it was really common back then. So we are right here in this part. So that basically, that area of my diagram, oh my God, is basically describing how generations viewed um, mental health or had these cultural norms, perhaps, throughout these generations, we incorporated and developed these cultural standards. And one of which is being silent about your emotions. A lot of us grew up in households that don't talk about how you feel, shut down, be silent, shut up. And we got scared and we thought it was shameful, and that didn't allow us to be our full, authentic, vulnerable selves. So all of that stems from these cultural standards that we developed throughout the century of generations ago. Growing up, stress is of major impact. Parents who experience chronic stress, so like going through the life cycle, and then we have our parents, our mom, father, when they experience chronic stress, that's basically like PTSD, and that stems from this idea of epigenetics. What that means is that you have this blocker on your DNA where it's not giving you that ability to meet it fully. Maybe that's completely negated. It's like an on and off switch, but it doesn't change your sequence or your code, your genetic code. It doesn't change anything like that. It's basically like a blocker. It negates that DNA sequence. So, as parents, we're taught, let's say within like Gen X, to be silent, to not talk about your emotions. That altered our parents, our grandparents' DNA, where that then those cells mutated and those cells evolved and didn't give us that full ability. We were basically my generation, Gen Z, or millennials, or anyone, in fact, basically set up to fail. And as these unprecedented, unforeseen actions that are going through our bodies, we don't really think about that. We go through daily life with stress, and a lot of us don't really have the skills to just work through that process and grab a hold of it before it ruptures. So he dips into the next generations, and all in all, the best way to describe this is, okay, the parents experience stress, it negates that DNA going into the next generation, where that generation is not able to work through that similar stress occurrence like their parents. Children won't be able to work through that similar case properly. They will react how their parents reacted. All right. Now, delving into the science of trauma, which I had talked about in previous episodes, and I talked about all this in previous episodes, but on this one specific mission episode, my research. When we experience trauma, right? Going recap, we experience trauma throughout these century of generations ago, which created this cultural ideology of how we should behave as humans, and that didn't allow us to be our full authentic selves, where we could be vulnerable with how we feel, due to the idea of epigenetics, because our parents were taught that, therefore our mindset is the same and we react similarly to the same occurrence our parents went through, because we don't know how to work through that due to the DNA sequence being blocked. All right. So when we experience trauma through our senses, and the thing in our brain that reacts first is the thalamus. What the thalamus does is uses all the senses except smell to dissect it as a stressor, as trauma. It's like a light bulb. Then the next process is the amygdala. Right up here, the amygdala. That just determines if it's a threat. It also uses the sense smell throughout dissecting and detecting this threat. Next, we get into the autonomic nervous system with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus goes through these two processes: the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, and your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your rest and digest. So we react in this fight sense, fleet or flight sense, freeze, we freeze, or we fawn, trying to give ourselves to that person, trying to negate, like, oh, I know it happened, all that. And when this happens, we experience this threat response in ourselves. Then, while we are under this threat response, cortisol gets released. We have adrenaline, our heart rate increases, our stress hormones increase. And then we have the sense of hunger, because we're using our body's energy. So we have a lot of enzymes going on. And one really important hormone, DHEA, is what our body produces to capture that moment so we know how to work through it the next time. Hopefully, if our ideology of epigenetics doesn't negate that process. After we go through the sympathetic nervous system, we go through the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest. This is allowing our body to go through digesting what we just went through, what we occurred. Also, our gut health is readjusting because our microbiome is all fluctuating now, and our food is now digesting. I had to halt for a second there. And we go through this challenge response as well, which is adrenaline and dopamine go through our body. And then we have this tend and befriend response, which occurs through oxytocin. So there are different responses to when we experience stress. So a little recap. The thalamus uses all of our senses, basically put a light on after our body occurs a moment of trauma or stress. The thalamus turns on that light. Then the amygdala uses all of the senses as well as smell, unlike the thalamus, to determine if it's a threat. Then we go into the hypothalamus, the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, fawn modes. And then we have the threat response, which basically releases cortisol, adrenaline, DHEA. And then we have the tend to befriend response, which releases oxytocin, just depending on how we react towards the stress. And then finally, we also have this challenge response. After going through the sympathetic nervous system and the responses that our body chooses to go through, meaning that if we don't know how to grasp onto that moment, our body is just going to take over. So we need to learn how to be aware of our emotions and be aware of our reactions. After experiencing the sympathetic nervous system, we have the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest. Our body goes through this process where it's working through how to work through it next time. Our food is starting to digest more. Our body's basically in relaxed mode because it needs to do any form of healing as well. After that, when it comes to the rest and digest, we go to the enteric nervous system. This is the mind-gut axis. It goes through our gastrointestinal process, for instance. So when we digest food, when we absorb food, our mind-gut axis, this basically, science proves that our gut is our second brain. And they work together. Our brain and our gut make hormones, they make neurotransmitters, they send messages to one another. When we experience trauma or chronic stress, our microbiome fluctuates. Therefore, we see an increase in gut motility. We also have an increase in IBS or leaky gut. So we're not getting a whole lot of absorption happening if our gut's messed up, our microflora, called intestinal permeability. When we have that, we are also dealing with inflammation, which cortisol kind of goes hand in hand with that. Sometimes it helps with inflammation, sometimes it doesn't, just depending on the form of cortisol. When we experience chronic stress, we formulate these behavior actions. We start to develop different coping mechanisms. We start to develop unhealthy habits, maybe good habits, for instance. Maybe we're wanting to not be in that and we react in a positive way, for instance. All I want to say is having a healthy lifestyle is important. Stress is really, it comes down to how we age, and I'll get to that right now. When we experience chronic stress, we feel it in different parts of our bodies, but we don't feel it way in our cells. Maybe we feel the ending of it, or the last wave, or whatever you want to call it. Our cells go through this cell life cycle, right? just the same as any living being goes through a life cycle. It multiplies itself. It breaks apart. Yeah. So it breaks apart and it multiplies. Cells multiply. That's basically its life cycle. However, each time it multiplies, because whenever we experience stress, we have this oxidative radical damage in our bodies, and our cells are fluctuating, as well as our gut, as well as our brain, as well as our whole body is in this reaction mode. And each time it has to heal itself, its telomeres shorten, and it stops its sequence. It stops dividing. Therefore, we start increasing these terrible bad cell growth. As a result, we develop these chronic diseases. We have an increase in autoimmune diseases. We have an increase in aging. We have an increase in neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia. We have an increase in cardiovascular because our heart rate is so high when we experience stress. We have an increase in type 2 diabetes and obesity because we develop these bad habits for ourselves and these terrible coping mechanisms when it comes to our relationship with food. And when we experience stress, we crave sugar, we crave fats because our body's trying to give its energy out, and it needs more energy. So we start developing this relationship. We also start experiencing depression and chronic anxiety. So stress causes all these diseases for our humankind. And I want to stress that because we're trying to find these answers for these uncurable diseases when it all comes down to how one handles stress. It's stress. And how to heal from trauma. We need to talk about trauma. We need to discuss generational trauma and the idea of epigenetics and how we as a society develop these cultural ideas and mindsets because we were raised very sheltered. We were raised very shut in and silence and only speak when you're spoken to. And don't cry and don't show your authentic self. I think we were deemed to fail. And I believe that if we don't have a handle on it, we're just starting to get noticed when it comes to chronic diseases because they're the highest it's ever been, So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this podcast episode. Hopefully that was enough for you to handle. Like I said, I'm coming out with my third book in June about it, and I discuss it a little bit more in depth and the individual process. If anyone's interested in one-on-one coaching, I am also a certified health and wellness coach. I offer a free hour new client consultation, so visit nurturingrootscoaching.com. If you're still in this turmoil of wanting to be the best you can be and wanting to continue to have hope and faith that it will all work out in the end, because believe me, I've been there and it will be perfectly okay. And I'm here of support. I'm here to support you. I'm here to guide you on your journey to be the best you can be. Thank you for watching Puzzling Minds podcast and or listening to it. It's your host, Michael Maddocks, self-published author and certified health and wellness coach. Like, share, and follow this page. Thank you and have a fantastic